We have a lot of great programs planned for this year. I have some programs that I'm still brainstorming, and there's a couple people in the room I haven't spoken to yet that I think hopefully we'll do a program. Don't worry, I won't commit you until I've spoken to you first, but I have some ideas, so I'll make sure that's going on. Is that going on?
Yeah.
Good, thank you. Okay.
Is the audio on?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Well, I think this program works out really well for the timing because of what's been going on in the community. But back this summer, when the Historical Society and the museum were doing a lot to celebrate the McMinn County, the Athens City Bicentennial, 1822 to 2022, I was thinking about something to mention some of the great Athenians of all time, just to sort of summarize them. And a lot of names came to mind, you know, people still with us, like Burkett Witt, and recently passed away Larry Wallace, and some still with us like Norma Corn White, and Nadine Cunningham, Prof. Powers recently passed away. They all came to mind, and some from way back, like E.B. Madison and Tom Sherman, I'm going to mention today very briefly, and Professor Nash, J.L. Cook, J.L. Robb, a lot of people like that. Maybe not necessarily always from here, but they had a lot to do with this community. But I'd always kind of known that a guy named Madison was a lawyer around here. I just remember reading this book and reading in various local history books, and the name popped up. But I'd always assumed growing up that Madison Avenue and Jackson Street were named after the presidents, and they weren't. And I can't quite remember who is the namesake of Jackson Street. Someone who may know.
R.C. Jackson.
R.C. Jackson, okay.
Yeah,
and then
railroad president.
Yeah, it makes sense with that office there across from Marshall Church. And on Madison Avenue, it's sort of named after the president and E.B., so I'll get to that for sure. But I think this will be a good program fitting with the bicentennial of the city of Athens and highlighting some of our local history and some of our greatest citizens. Well, as you all have experienced over the years, Madison Avenue has always been a hub of our community. We have the recently refurbished building right across the way here where the county court clerk works, where we get our tags. That's from the McMinn County Bicentennial when we had the birthday party and Phil Tugg was handing out all the cupcakes. And I don't know who jumped out of that cake there. I can't remember if it was you or maybe Joe or Phil, but anyways, I was right there on Madison Avenue. That's where everything is. Every election, usually in August and November for local elections, you know, everyone crowds on the courthouse waiting for election commission to announce the winners, and sometimes tears are shed. You know, I've been there, it happens, but that's where we all are, and it's one of the most important thoroughfares in our entire community. And it's named after this man, E.B. Madison. And it may be a little bit difficult to see here, but this overhead view right here, the old courthouse, and this right here is the clerk's office, former Bayless Hardware. So there's Madison, there's Washington, there's White on the left, and then Jackson on the right, and then that's when they meet up there close to a night park. I think that's from the 50s before the courthouse burned. Now the connection to President Madison, this is something I didn't know until very recently. I can look at this here, okay. So, President Madison is a founding father. He did not sign the Declaration of Independence, but he did sign the U.S. Constitution. He's considered the father of the Constitution, not so much because of the ideas he brought to the table. Actually, a lot of his ideas are rejected, including electing the president by popular vote. But he's the one who got all the other ideas and came with all the other compromises from the big states like Virginia and the small states like Delaware to create the Constitution we have today. He was born in 1751, died in 1836, same year as the Alamo. He's the oldest of 12 children of James Sr., and he was fourth president from 1809 to 1817. Now, these are some possessions that some are still in the possession of E.B. Madison's family, and some have been sold to collectors. This is his watch. This watch was manufactured, they estimate, in 1811, which would have been in his first term. And E.B.'s great-grandson, who was a great help to me during my research, he actually had it sent to Switzerland a few years ago to have it restored. So, sounds very appropriate. This is the presidential decanter I am not a big drinker. I had no idea what a decanter was till I had to look it up. But this is where President Madison's liquor was poured from. So that's another thing that's, I believe, still in possession of the E.B. Madison's great-grandchildren there in Texas. Now his ancestors, we'll start with General William T. Madison, born in 1762. I don't know if you can see there, but he's actually President Madison's youngest brother to survive adulthood. He was born 11 years after the president in 1762. He was E.B.'s great-grandfather. Then we get to the really good stuff with the president. E.B.'s grandfather, Robert Louis Madison Sr., born in 1794, died in 1828. He was the president's favorite nephew. He stayed at the White House with his uncle during the winter of 1812. I should have looked this up. I can't remember what month the War of 1812 started. If anyone knows, please tell me. But in the winter of that year, he was staying with his uncle at the White House. And he also served in the Virginia House of Delegates. He'd once toasted the Marquis de Lafayette, one of the heroes of the American Revolution, very close to President Washington, while James Madison was in the room. And the president left money for his nephew's kids, so his great-nephews, including E.B.'s grandfather. Because E.B.'s grandfather was born in 1828, not long after his father, Robert Louis Sr., passed away. So this is E.B.'s father, the lawyer that some folks in this room knew. This is his dad, born in 1828. Attended the College of William and Mary, University of Virginia, and Jefferson College for his medical degree. So he was Virginian through and through. He was a teacher and surgeon at VMI, the Virginia Military Institute, in, I believe, Lexington, which is right next to the campus of Washington and Lee University. He was the surgeon in the Confederate Army and a physician for Stonewall Jackson, who, of course, was killed by friendly fire early in the war. And he was also the family physician for General Robert E. Lee. And General Lee passed away in 1870, 5 years after the Civil War ended. And he wasn't, back then I guess it was old, he was only in his early 60s when he passed, but his health was failing after the war, and E.B. Madison's father, Dr. Madison, was helping take care of him before he passed in 1870. His first wife passed away. His second wife was Helen Bannister. She was a granddaughter of John W. Bannister, a member of the Continental Congress back in, I believe, 1774, before we even declared our independence. And he's a veteran of the American Revolution and a descendant of Pocahontas, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about later. Pocahontas and John Rolfe, not John Smith, as Disney would have you believe. So. And his youngest child is E.B. So there you go. We have President Madison's youngest brother, and then his youngest kid, and then his youngest kid, and then we have the Athenian E.B. Madison. So that's the distance. His relation to President Madison is the same as mine to Harry T. Byrne, but Harry T. Byrne would have been 90-something when I was born, whereas President Madison would have been 119 when E.B. was born. So the huge gap there in age. Edmund Bowling Madison, known as Bowling or E.B., was born in 1870, the same year General Lee died. Born in Lexington City, Virginia. His father passed away when he was 8, and him and his mother came to Athens when he was 12. And she actually had some property, I believe a plantation or something like that, down in Alabama. I guess that's got them closer to that. And he went to Grant University, now Tennessee Wesleyan University, Southern University in Greensboro, Alabama, and the University of Alabama Law School. He read law under Colonel T.M. Burkitt, who I had no idea was apparently one of the most prominent lawyers in Athens history. He was buried in Cedar Grove, and I'm sure he's mentioned in Patsy's book. Anyone who's anyone in Cedar Grove who died before 1939 is in her book, so I recommend that. And he started practicing law in 1891, right near the turn of the century, at age 21. His wife was Martha Burkitt McKeldin, 10 years younger, born in 1880, and they married in 1896. And of course, as some of you may know, the McKeldin family was a very prominent family in Athens, and they were staunch Confederates. Her father, a Confederate soldier, W.B. McKeldin, and her grandfather, Andrew McKeldin, was actually born in Northern Ireland in the early 1800s. And I'm trying to think about, see, Ireland itself got independence in 1921, but Northern Ireland, that was under British rule for a long time. But that, just imagine how things were in Northern Ireland in the early 1800s. Now here is his E.B.'s daughter, his only child, Helen Dolly Madison. And yes, she was named after First Lady of the United States, Dolly Madison. And by the way, Dolly Madison was actually the first lady to play hostess, sort of turning the First Lady, reinventing, she's the fourth president, but, sort of just establishing what the First Lady's duty was at that time, be the hostess of the White House. So she's named for her great-great-grandaunt, I think that's right, something like that. So she was born in 1897, passed away in 1990, and here's E.B. with her around 1898 or 1899. Here she is as a young lady. And here she is in The Lookout. This was a magazine or a newspaper that was published by Zella Armstrong, an early pioneer in female journalism in Chattanooga, Lookout Mountain. And it says, a little great-niece and namesake of Dolly Madison, Miss Dolly Madison, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. E. Bowling Madison of Athens, Tennessee, representing the 10th and 13th generations from Pocahontas. So multiple sources explaining E.B.'s mother's lineage from Pocahontas and John Rolfe in the early Virginia days, 400 plus years ago. Now this is Helen Dolly Madison in her later years. She married John T. Boggess, who, if I'm not mistaken, John T. Boggess would be a great uncle of Dr. Charles Cox, who practices on Madison Avenue. They moved to Louisville, Kentucky, and they had one child named Helen Boggess, and she married a man named O'Mara, and she passed away in Texas, and she's over here on the right. So E.B. became a grandfather in 1925 when she was born. He was 55 at the time. And she's probably about 10 years old here, so he's in his 60s here. And I'm not sure what he had, but he had some sort of a health problem where he always leaned his neck to one side. And, well, she has her dog there. So he has had one daughter and one granddaughter. And, of course, he got to spend a lot of time with them. And there's a diary I'm going to have some pages from, but the family donated a diary to the museum from 1925. And it's a perfect year because some of the things that were going on. And one of them, he noted, was the birth of his granddaughter. He said, I'm a grandpa now, in late 1925. So political activity, very political man. He was elected secretary of the McMinn County Democratic Party Executive Committee in 1892. So 1 year out of the bar, he's already in politics, so didn't waste any time there. He was elected to the Athens City Board of Aldermen, now the City Council, in 1894. He was on there for a little while, not forever. 1897, he was appointed a colonel on the staff of Governor Robert Love Taylor. Now, I don't know if they still do this, and this is my opinion, but back then, all sorts of people, usually the people who were supportive of the governor in their campaigns or politics, they would make someone a colonel on their staff, or an honorary colonel, just like with Ellis's manager was Colonel Tom Parker, because the Louisiana governor made him a colonel in 1930 or something like that. It's not a military title. A lot of people would use it just to kind of inflate their ego. But Colonel Madison, so good for him. And in 1909, he was elected Justice of the Peace, which will now be a county commissioner, and served on the county court, now county commission, for 24 years. Now this is his diary from 1925. He wrote down everything he was feeling, thinking, how, his health, the weather, all sorts of stuff. And he reported on the quarterly court meeting. I only wanted to emphasize this one because court elected H.M. Candler county attorney. Herschel Candler, of course, was the senator who wrote the bitter speech and inspired Harry T. Burns Miller to write him the letter. And he later practiced law with Wallace Hitch. And I believe Wallace's daughter was Mildred Hitch. Yeah, so I definitely wanted to mention Senator Candler, or State Senator Candler here. He was like I said, he was secretary of the party for 40 years. By 1932, they decided we're going to elect you secretary for life, serving under the administrations of President Cleveland all the way through President Truman for 56 years. All the way till he died. And he said, they said, well, why aren't you more ambitious, A.B.? Why don't you run for something, run for legislature or something like that? or party chairman, you know. I'd rather be a doorkeeper in the house of the Lord than dwell in the tents of the wicked forever. So hopefully he wasn't talking about the Republicans, but who knows. So. Now, right across the way here where we get our tags, it was called Madison Hall, and I'm not sure where he practiced after that. He may have been in the same general area, but he sold the building, and then, of course, Reba Boyer's grandfather, John W. Bayless, ran the hardware store there, and then Cherokee Hardware, and these pictures are both from the Historical Society. And just like today, a lot of lawyers have their offices right on the courthouse square. Now, his legal career, I'm going to talk about one trial in a minute, but he didn't have a partner very long. He practiced with Wiley Gasson for about a decade, and he was also city attorney. And then he went on his own in 1900 and never had a partner again. Some of the cases he was involved in, I read this in a book a few years ago. In 1894, incumbent Governor Peter Turney was running against Henry Clay Evans, a Republican from Chattanooga. And Evans actually won. And to give you an idea, between 1880 and 1970, there were 2 Republicans elected governor. 1910, Ben Hooper, 1920, Alfred Taylor, the same year as the women's suffrage vote. But Evans actually won the statewide governor's race by less than 1,000 votes, and it was contested. The legislature determined that there was fraud, and they actually determined they needed to throw out just enough ballots to, what do you know, give it to Peter Turney by less than 100 votes. So Peter Turney remained governor, and EB was involved in that early in his career. So contested elections and accusations of fraud are nothing new. There's nothing new under the sun. I wish the younger generation knew that. 1932, elected as the first chairman of the McMinn County Bar Association. He actually helped create the bar here. And that's actually later on in his life. I thought it would have been older than that, 1932. And then in 1941, for 50 years practicing law, he was honored at a barbecue. Unfortunately, he couldn't attend because of his health, but they still had the party anyways. And anyone came by. Judge Sue K. Hicks, Judge Pat Quinn, Chancellor T.L. Stewart, whose son later became a U.S. Senator, all the politicians from the surrounding counties, you know, all the sheriffs and legislators, anybody was there. And they gave him this, I think I can see this, Edmund Bowling Madison, a token of esteem from McMinn County Bar, 1941. And it has pins inside, really fancy ink pens. And this is the picture that his great-grandson sent me that's now in the family's possession. So, I didn't really find a lot of resources on this murder trial here, but or killing, I don't know which one, but Tom Sherman apparently killed his brother Frank. And some of you in the room may have known Tom Sherman. I know Fred remembers seeing Tom Sherman when he was young, eating black bananas, and a very eccentric man. But that was one that he was involved in early 1900s. And then there was a case against the Ellen Railroad in Etowah where they had to pay $500,000. Imagine that back in 19 teens. And he said, there hasn't been a murder case in McMinn County since 1892 that I haven't been on one side or the other. I don't think I could do that, but he did. So I'm going to talk about this one really quick. Okay, so James McKeldin was shot to death by his wife, Myrtle Compton McKeldin, in 1943. And they lived in the McKeldin house, which I'm not mistaken, used to be where the downtown Hardee's is now, somewhere around there. And he was a veteran of World War II, and I believe World War I as well, and this is all allegedly. He had a drinking problem, and he was actually out, apparently, like in his underwear one day, and some neighbors saw him, and then Myrtle came out and shot him, and she said, well, he was threatening me. He was, violent drunk, and it went to trial, and Beecher Witt, longtime district attorney from this area, we've had Jerry Estes and Steve Bevan, Steve Crump, but Beecher Witt, the legend, 4 terms. Of course, he led the prosecution, and Herschel Candler and E.B. Madison also helped with the prosecution. And Ruel Webb, a famous Etowah attorney, was her defense counsel. And this was a sensational trial. In the DPA, they actually printed out every word spoken in testimony on several pages, and that was a slog to get through. I got to go through some of it, but it looked pretty convincing that what she had actually killed him for no good reason. And even if there were threats, you know, or she felt endangered, it was kind of tough for the case to be made. So the jury was hung, I think it was 10-2. We're going to find her guilty for manslaughter. A very, you know, that seemed fair. A minor punishment, you know, a few years in prison, because it wasn't a premeditated, cold-blooded murder, but also it was not justified. And so there was a hung jury, and Judge Sue K. Hicks, the namesake of a boy named Sue, he was the judge, and they decided to try the case again in early 1944, and it got delayed and delayed, and finally, in late 1945, the state decided to drop the suit. And noli prosequi, I don't know if there's any lawyers in here, it means wish not to prosecute. So, yeah, and then she sold the house, and that wasn't a good look, you know, but that's what happened. So there you go. He was involved in that too. And see, the McKeldin name you may recognize. James was his nephew by marriage, his wife's nephew, and of course Myrtle was his niece. And during the whole trial, she kept saying on the stand, "Oh, yes, Uncle Bowling, yes, Uncle Bowling." They're trying to keep it informal, you know. That's all I know about that trial. So. Now, remember, the diary is 1925. The Scopes trial happens this year. He's writing about it, not much. He didn't get to go. Some lawyers went, some didn't, but Mrs. M, I'm assuming that's his wife, Mrs. Madison, went to Dayton with something. First day of Scopes trial, guilty, $100 fine, heard all the big guns. Yes, Brian and Darrow. Yeah, so this handwriting is so tiny I could barely read it. I've got pretty good eyes. And then I mentioned some earlier names of other legal people he was a friend of, some other attorneys and judges. And if you look right here, this lady has taken a curtain off of this. This is Judge John J. Blair. He was a longtime criminal court judge, and when he passed away, he was replaced by Sue K. Hicks, you know, a boy named Sue. And E.B. Madison was there for the unveiling. I'm not sure who these folks are, but this is actually from the Historical Society, and it's written on the back that unveiling of the portrait of the late Judge John J. Blair.
I was looking for a picture of Blair, so that's him.
Yeah, we got one.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and I'm sure you recognize Blair from you know what. So. Now his community life, I wanted to highlight a few things there too. He introduced a resolution on the county court, now county commission, to work with Bradley County to build a drawbridge on the Hiwassee River. He led an effort to help clean up Knight Park, which apparently at the time, about 100 years ago, was an eyesore. They were throwing a lot of it was like a dump for the community, and then he helped get that cleaned up and looking nice. And then he was a good friend of R.J. Fisher of the Athens Textile Mill and defended them from alleged accusations of unsafe labor practices, child labor violations, and what he considered slander. Definitely someone you wanted to have on your side in court. And he worked with the Fisher, Geddes, and Matlock families to establish a second water company for Athens, utilizing the Ingleside Spring. So very involved citizen in many ways. And this is from his diary. Of course, I had to look at what happened with July 4th when him and his family celebrated in Etowah with his connection to President Madison. So he talks about that in here. And then he passed away on February 1st, 1948. He was actually sick for over a year and didn't actually set foot in his law office after Christmas of 46. But, you know, some of those old lawyers, you know, they never really retire. They say, "I'm not retired," and it's like, we haven't been in a while, so, you know, that's how it is. That's how some of Harry T. Burns' friends were when I interviewed them in Rockwood. But he passed away at his home on South Jackson Street, right across from St. Paul's Church. And, of course, they did the funeral at Evans Funeral Home, now Smith. Pallbearers included Judge Frank K. Boyd, no relation. Me, my dad, and my Uncle Rudy are the only Boyds left, and we've not let anybody other Boyd here, just so you know. And also another pallbearer was Wallace Hitch, law partner of Herschel Candler. And then 1 year later, Main Street was renamed Madison Avenue in his honor. The best evidence indicates that the Madison Avenue, where the historic homes are behind First Baptist Church, where Bill Selden lived, was named Madison Avenue many years before E.B. died, probably named for the president. But Bill Selden, the last charter member of this organization who passed away 10 years ago, he remembered in 1949, working at Mayfield's, living on that street. They renamed Main Street from the hill down there by First Baptist Church all the way out to, I don't know how far the street went in 1949. Maybe it went to the hospital, I don't know. I doubt it went all the way out to the Dominion Assisted Living, but that whole stretch of Madison now was Main, and it was renamed Madison in his honor.
Is that stone at Cedar Grove?
Yes, it is. Now, the last thing I'll talk about is a copy of the Declaration of Independence. E.B., believe it or not, was actually in possession of a copy of the Declaration of Independence. This is actually an article from the Washington Post from very recent. So I'll try to summarize what happened here really quick. The original Declaration of Independence in 1776, there were only a few copies made, and I believe the first one that they actually signed, the first one is in a vault, not on display, and it's deteriorating. Some of the others from that same year are on display in the National Archive in Washington. If you go there, they have it under glass, and they have, like, special gases in there to keep it from deteriorating. Well, there were only a few made. And then in 1824, there was a man named W.B. Stone, and he was really good at recreating these things. So 1824, let's see, that's President Monroe. Him and Congress get together, and they plan to have a few dozen of these declarations reproduced to look really nice. And this isn't a very good picture, but you can see there's a lot of, stains and rips here. And then right there is the stone version that was redone. So it's not original, but 1824, that's pretty neat. It's pretty significant. So President Monroe got a copy. Former President Madison got a copy. Former Presidents Jefferson and Adams got a copy. Several members of Congress. And then when, remember, President Madison's favorite nephew, E.B.'s grandfather, he gave it to his nephew, who gave it to Dr. Madison, who gave it to E.B. But before E.B. got it, his mother, when they were living in Virginia during the Civil War, E.B. wasn't born yet. She actually was afraid that some soldiers, and I don't know which side, Confederate or Union in Virginia, of course, it was the epicenter of the war. She hid her copy of the Declaration of Independence behind the house, the wallpaper in the house. That way no one would find it. Pretty good idea. And then, of course, E.B. got it. And then E.B.'s granddaughter, she got it, and then she passed away 8 years ago. And, see, is that the right one? Okay, yes, it is. So E.B. had it in his law office, and then his granddaughter had it, and then the great-grandson got it from her, and he found it in a frame, and it was, the frame was broken, and he sold it to David Rubenstein, a billionaire collector. And it undisclosed amount. He said it was 7 figures, so lucky him. But that's pretty neat that there was a copy of the Declaration of Independence from 1824 in his office here in Athens, Tennessee. And I wanted to mention that. And just give you a little bit of presidential trivia, how it connects to our community, and to tell you about the namesake of Madison Avenue, one of our finest citizens. And I hope you all enjoyed it. And that's about all I know about him. If you have any questions, let me know.
To see Dr. Rubenstein this summer at the National Society of Daughters of the American Revolution Continental Congress in D.C. And they honored him with some plaque because he kept that preserved, that same paper. And it is one that is in archives being displayed.
Oh, yeah, very good.
What year did you say his order?
He was elected in, I think, 1890, something like that. So,
Is he associated with the Lee Highway project?
that I couldn't tell you. I don't know about that. It wouldn't surprise me if he was. He was very civic-minded.
I just wondered if he may have been on the panel or something, maybe reasons they named after him.
All right, well, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoyed.